Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have two guests. This is about the second time I've had two guests on the podcast. They are both colleagues and work together, and so I wanted to have both of them to kind of give me their different angles in which they research and study the same topic. My guests are Paul Grant, who's a clinical psychologist and co-director of the Center for Recovery-Oriented Cognitive Therapy, also known as CT-R. And he has worked alongside Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's probably the most well-known therapy in the clinical world for the past 20 years, and has originated and advanced CT-R, and has done quite a lot of extensive research in this area. My other guest is Ellen Inverso. She is also a licensed psychologist and subject matter expert in CT-R. She is the current director of clinical training at the Aaron Beck Center and provides clinical training and supervision for interns, postdocs, etc. She is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Recovery-Oriented Cognitive Therapy for Schizophrenia, which I believe was just released. This was a great conversation. I've said before that I always feel kind of like at home base talking with colleagues and people in my field within the world of psychology. And I was really excited to talk with folks that are doing a specific brand of CBT, but also we talk a lot about CBT itself. And I think that's important because many times when something becomes very popular, people kind of forget the nuts and bolts of it, how it was originated, what its functions are. So we talk a little bit about that in the first half of the conversation. We start out by giving a background of Beck's cognitive model. One of the really cool things about Paul is that he's worked with Aaron Beck, side by side for 20 plus years. So he gives a lot of really cool stories and such throughout the conversation. We talk about the cognitive model and how, over time, it's going to look a little bit different, right? The model is going to be the model, but the way it looks in therapy may start to change as we move forward into the future. We give an overview of the theoretical framework of cognitive theory. We talk about the power of cognitive behavioral therapy as evidence-based and why that's important. We talk about the ability to use CBT techniques without conceptualizing within the theory. Basically, many people will not be formally trained in the theory and research and just will pull interventions to use in therapy. And we talk about the utility of that and how that could be done appropriately. We talk about recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, what that is and how it focuses primarily on the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, but how it is also branched into other aspects and in other disorders. We talk about how both of them do a really nice job about talking about how it interacts with humanism and how there is some integrative approaches from other therapies more thematically and how it is a very human-centered approach. We talk about some of the differences between recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, CT-R, and CBT for psychosis. That's a subset of CBT and what the differences are and how they're similar and how they could both be used. We talk about the clinical trials and evidence-based support for CT-R and the cultural implications for CT-R, along with many other topics. I have to say this was such a fun conversation. I really, really liked that I got both of them on because they complement each other very well. They're both very lovely. And you can really see a healthy balance that they have. Ellen is right in the thick of it, on the front lines, doing training with the next clinicians and the next generation on recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And she provides a lot of wonderful insights into not only the model and how to use it, but also how to train future clinicians, which is so terribly important. We need really strong clinicians in the field. And Paul is also fantastic in the fact that he is doing the research and has done the research and continues to do that and trying to understand best ways to reach folks with different disorders or clinical syndromes, and many other ways this could be applied to other disorders. So I really felt privileged to talk to both of them. They gave me about a little over 2 hours, which was so generous. And I was so very grateful for that. And so now I bring you Paul Grant and Ellen Inverso. I'm here with Ellen Inverso and Paul Grant. Thank you both for coming on the podcast and going to talk about some really fun stuff. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Definitely. Thank you. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah. So since I have two of you, it's not the first time I've done it on my podcast, but it's not a common thing. It's always fun. Why don't you both just start just by saying, who you are, what you do, your areas of research, current work, and any stuff in the future that you're planning on working on. So just kind of give us the kind of potted biography a little bit.
Paul, go ahead.
All right. So my name is Paul Grant. I work at the Beck Institute Center for Recovery-Oriented Cognitive Therapy. And I am one of the originators of recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, along with Aaron Beck. So I think we'll be talking a fair amount about that. I'm focused on sort of developing innovative approaches to, I think, what are sometimes historically very challenging conditions, and trying to develop in collaboration with Ellen and the team, very practical ways of trying to address those and really sort of lead to some really great progress in lives that might not be have been as possible without this. So largely focused on people who are particularly stuck. And my focus is there's some research in it, there's some theory in it, and then there's the sort of practical way in which you try to help people learn how to do it and then capture that they actually are doing it and that it makes a difference.
No, that's great. That's great. Alan, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm the Director of Clinical Training and Implementation at Beck Institute Center for Recovery-Oriented Cognitive Therapy, and have been partnering with Paul and Dr. Aaron Beck for almost 8 years at this point on the work in recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, or CT-R. And from my end, I see myself as I'm a clinician. I'm a licensed psychologist. I just love figuring out how to make it work, how to connect with people, how to use our understanding of people and where they're at to just come up with really creative interventions and just really, like Paul said, practical strategies for kind of get people doing the things that really matter to them and living the lives they want. Paul and I both have the really good fortune of being a part of a pretty amazing team. Currently, we have about 11 members on our team, a mix of psychologists and licensed counselors. We have a psychologist who's also a registered nurse. We work with research coordinators and also have postdoctoral fellows. So part of my role is also to do the supervision and training for people who are going for licensure in psychology, which is one of my favorite parts of my job.
Yeah, that's right when you're right in the last hoop of sorts of trying to exactly. Get over the board. Yeah. So that's great. That's great. So we were talking before we started that, I'm also a clinician. I have a doctorate of psychology, et cetera. So there's, it will be a lot of clinicians talking, but also want to make sure we, explain it to people where they can understand it well. So I will do my best to keep that in mind, but it's always fun to talk with colleagues and clinicians. I always get a kick out of that. So it's great. So let's start with, we're going to talk about CT-R a lot, and that's what I'm really excited to talk about and hear about. And so I've obviously read a little bit about it. And so I want to really hear more about it, but let's start with cognitive theory and then I guess, CBT at large. And we can, because I know that's incorporated into CT-R. So I think if we give a good foundation for that, then we can launch into CT-R and get into the details. So both of you have worked with Aaron Beck, and so you've been close to the source here on this. So I don't know if you want to give kind of on the theoretical side. It doesn't have to be super intensive, but the theoretical side of cognitive theory, and then how that has blended into cognitive behavioral therapy, and just kind of give an overlay of that. I can start it off, or you guys can start off, either or.
Oh, I think we'd be comfortable, and then you can jump in. That's okay.
I'm sure. Yeah, please.
I have sort of some stuff about that, and then Ellen does too. I've worked with Dr. Beck now for more than 20 years, and so I've heard him talk about this a lot. And initially, for him, what happened is that he was trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy, and he actually he's been pretty frank that he found it difficult to make it work. And he and his wife would have some conversations about this because she didn't like to see him suffering so much trying to learn how to do it. And so he conducted a study that he published in 1959, where he basically could not find evidence for the psychodynamic theory of introjected anger. Instead, he was analyzing people's dreams. And what instead he found is what I think led to the cognitive model, because what he found is that their dreams were full of beliefs of being defeated, beliefs about being incapable and not really having a future and that kind of thing. And so in 1963, he published what now has to be a revolutionary paper in psychiatry, and that's where he lays out the cognitive model, and where he really looks at how people are suffering, how they're having a difficult time functioning in terms of beliefs. And I was in a seminar with some people from I'm going to forget their names. I apologize, but they're from University of Virginia, and they were a generation down from Beck. But they really talked about how that paper and its companion paper were really just something. They're kind of amazing because they turned everything around. Beliefs were important, and emotions came after them rather than emotions being the big thing and all that kind of thing. And that's really at the heart of everything. And I think that because that paper was published about 60 years ago, or nearly 60 years ago, it's close to my birth date, so I'm kind of aging myself here. It has really been applied across the board everywhere. And that's often, and so we come to the point, I think, when we talk about people's problems, their suffering, psychological problems, psychiatric problems, however you want to call them, that the cognitive model seems to be transdiagnostic. However you want to look at these things, it's been applied to just about everything, from depression and personality disorders, anxiety, and that kind of thing, to chronic pain, to people who have chronic conditions that will kill them, like cancer. It's really been applied across the board, and it's very, very useful for us in terms of determining how it is that people, again, really get stuck. They have problems. And if I didn't say it, one of the things he laid out is that it's beliefs about yourself. And so it's beliefs usually related to some kind of deficiency of self, in terms of incapability or sort of unlovability, these sorts of things. And there's also beliefs about other people, in terms of that they could be a source of threat, they could be malign against you, those kinds of things. And then finally, this is the third category is talked about in different ways. We tend to focus more on the aspect of a future. So what your beliefs are about your future. And of course, if you had very pessimistic beliefs about your future, it's hard to engage in treatment. It's hard to do the work that we're going to try to do. Sometimes people describe that also as the world, but those are the three categories. And it's I think I sent you an email where I said this, and this is probably a nice place to say this. I was at the ABCT, right? So that's the Behavioral Cognitive Therapies, the American Behavioral Cognitive Therapies Conference, probably 10 years ago. And somebody raised their hand and they asked him, they said, so what do you see in 50 years? He gets these kinds of questions because, at that point, he'd probably been doing it for 50 years. So, right, yeah. And he said this, and I thought it was, and I think it's right. And I think what we talk about today will show this. He said, I think the therapy will change. I think cognitive therapy could look very different in the future. But he says, I think the cognitive model is here to stay. He said, I think that 50 years from now, we'll still be using it, but the way it looks in practice could change a lot.
No, that's great. Ellen, do you want to add anything here?
No, I think, Paul got the history. Dr. Beck is, God willing, going to be turning 100 years old in July.
Yeah,
and he's seen a lot of things in his education and his experience. And I think that if you were to have asked him at the start of his career if we would be doing the things that we're doing now, working with individuals who experience some of the most, some really serious mental health challenges, schizophrenia, serious and extreme forms of self-harm, and all sorts of challenges associated with those, I think that he would have said, I don't know how that would look. I don't know that he would have thought we'd be where we are now with it. So I think it's really exciting evolution. And what I love about him in particular is that for someone who's been doing this for so long and is so like, he brought this to life, right? And he is still trying to learn and expand and grow. And I think that we could all probably take a really valuable lesson from that.
Yeah, that's very incredible to hear that. And that's super encouraging as well.
Yeah.
Paul, I liked what you're saying about the cognitive triad, no? Right? This is kind of self, others, and the world or future. Maybe just briefly, we can talk about kind of the essence of the cognitive model theoretically. So core beliefs, intermediary beliefs, automatic thoughts, as opposed by, situation, the thoughts, and then you have behaviors, emotions, et cetera. Maybe just kind of, both of you can run us through kind of the meat and core of the cognitive model, and then that will branch us off into some of the research put on there and some of the principles and practice, and then we can get forward onto the recovery oriented piece.
Yeah, I left the spin we take in the recovery orientation. I left it for soon. Maybe the easiest way to think about this would be one of the things that I was involved in with Dr. Beck was the extension of the cognitive model into schizophrenia, and in particular to negative symptoms. There had been, the cognitive therapy for depression, I think, was the really first successful implementation of this. And, that first book that he wrote in 1979 really kind of lays everything out that you just said, sort of how you think about the individuals with depression and how you work with them. And there were British people who extended that approach to schizophrenia. And so there's ways of thinking about, and we can talk about this later, hallucinations, hearing things that no one else hears, or delusions, which are sort of beliefs that are really hard to understand, in terms of the cognitive model. And there's a lot of research done into that. But when we got going on all of this, negative symptoms were really not something that was really the cognitive model been applied to. It was which in a way is kind of interesting, because the negative symptoms have to do with the people who don't have a lot of energy, or they don't seem to have access to motivation. They're often not very expressive. They often don't do a lot. And when you sort of look at that, it kind of makes you think of depression in some ways, except you don't usually have the dysphoria that goes along with depression. So it would be natural for Aaron Beck to think, maybe the cognitive model applies here. Yeah. So that's where we got going about 25 years ago. But I think it will lay out the things that you want to, and then I think it's a nice thing to then flip into some of the other discussions. So we interviewed a bunch of people, which is the classic Beck method. That's how we developed the cognitive model more thoroughly, is interviewing lots of individuals and taking lots of notes. And I think that what seemed to, if you ask somebody, when you were younger, you really liked to play basketball. Have you played it recently? And they said, no. And if you ask them very gently why that might be, the answer often was, I screwed up. I can't do that anymore. So core belief, which is sort of an I am belief, could be I am incompetent, I'm incapable, I'm broken. So we kind of came from the idea that those would be the deep beliefs that might be behind negative symptoms. But then what we were looking for is something closer to, what would come to somebody's mind when they have the opportunity to do something and they choose not to do it. Hey, you want to come? We're going to go outside and we're going to barbecue. Nah, I'm stay here, that kind of thing. So we came up with the idea that sort of concept of a defeatist belief, which I think a defeatist belief is something similar to what you were describing as a sort of the intermediary one. So, why try? I'm only going to fail, kind of thing. A small failure is the same as a catastrophe, those kinds of things. So and then the automatic thoughts that there's actually an interesting story about automatic thoughts. I'll get to that in a second. Sure. That would pop into somebody's head as, I can't, I don't, I'm a failure, any of those sorts of things that might pop into the person's head. And so we could talk about this if you want to, but we conducted some research to make these linkages. We could see that the people who endorse those things were more likely to have the stronger negative symptoms. And we could predict it in the future and that kind of thing. And that was new. That was new. And we discovered that many people have been able to reproduce that kind of result and utilize that. And negative symptoms are probably for people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or given one, probably the most debilitating aspect of the disorder. Ellen Sachs is a pretty famous person who, probably the most famous living person with schizophrenia, possibly. She wrote a very interesting book about her life. But one of the things that Ellen Sachs doesn't have, she by the way, is a law professor at USC. USC Law School, and has been very successful professionally. But she was somebody who got this diagnosis and was in the hospital, put into restraints. So she tells you her whole story, but she didn't have negative symptoms. One of the things she didn't have is negative symptoms. So I think they're really a part of the really hard part of all of this. The story about automatic thoughts, just for a second here, is I've watched Dr. Beck speak to teach psychiatric residents. He gets invited to do this from time to time. And he tries to show them how he discovered this concept, which is that he's talking to a particular, and I don't have to go through the details, he's working with a particular patient that he's stuck with. It just seems like he's missing something. And so he tries to get the audience to sort of see there's something between that we haven't talked about. There's some kind of thing that happens in the moment that just kind of jumps up there. And apparently, his daughter was like 11 years old or 12 years, Judy Beck, and she helped him name it when she was 11 years old. Wow. The concept. Anyway, it's a cool story. I mean, if he were a little healthier, I think he would be here telling it to you, but I just trying to share you some of the nuggets he shared with me.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
I was going to say, Ellen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, as far as the core of it, I think that's the typical way that people see the cognitive model. Something happens, and I think they're very relatable beliefs, right? As you were talking about, if I'm, why bother doing it? I'm going to mess it up. There's probably, 10 different things that I could imagine that I, wouldn't do because it doesn't feel like there's a point. And I think that one of the differences, one of the things that's really great about that is if we can relate at some level with anybody with these different sets of ideas about themselves, then it helps us to be really great partners, whether that's in treatment or just in kind of navigating life experiences. But I think that one of the differences is that a lot of the folks that we are working with don't apply it to just those couple little things that I might say, well, I'm not going to do this because I feel like I'm going to mess it up. They're more like, because I might mess this thing up, I can't do anything. So it's the global kind of weight of it that we're trying to crack through and to shift around a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think typically what can happen with patients is that there is this kind of cascade that happens. So it will be one negative thought and there will be multiple ones, and that will kind of do this loop of reinforcing some of these core negative beliefs, right? And so, but I think that's absolutely right. It's not to say that nobody has them. We all have them, right? We all have negative thoughts. We all have some beliefs that, maybe aren't the best for us. And the point is to not let them become too maladaptive or to, keep us stuck in a terrible way. And so, but I think what you're saying is absolutely right. There's a relatable point to that. It's like, look, this, you might be the patient or you might be in a certain setting, but we all have this. We all struggle with this in a sense. And so there's a kind of, in terms of, I know one of the, like with most therapies, but with cognitive therapy is, the therapeutic relationship then becomes really important because it's like, look, see, we can work together on trying to understand these things.
Yeah.
And so, Paul, you were saying about the idea of, how you were starting to understand this for the recovery oriented model. And so let me just ask quickly, as much as you want to share, I think, yes, cognitive theory started probably with depression, yeah, and then it started to really kind of branch out into many challenges and or disorders. And I would say that I think for most people, based on the evidence-based and empirical literature, is that CBT or some variant of it is kind of the gold standard for various anxiety disorders, and I'm sure many other disorders. But it is for the most part kind of the go-to primary treatment for many disorders. And I know, again, we keep hinting at it, but we'll get there. But with CT-R is more of a kind of an active or more kind of elevated kind of way of looking at things instead of just all the psychopathology. It's all the other aspects too. So we'll get there. But I guess in terms of cognitive theory, I mean, was that, as much as you know, was that kind of Aaron's like kind of model? Is he kind of was like, I want it to be kind of used for all these things, or it just kind of slowly just kind of built and built and built, and then like, boom, here's the like power of this model and how it can be really helpful therapeutically for different disorders and different challenges. Maybe say a little bit about that.
I think some of it is when it was developed and then sort of how the field of psychiatry evolved. Because if you go back to the 60s, you crack open the DSM-2, the DSM-2 looks like a little manual. It's very short.
It's very small. Yeah.
It's big on lumping things together. And so I think that but then with the emergence of the DSM-3, there were a lot more categories. And so I think what happened, CBT, because as Beck used to show up at the conferences, it was called AABT when he originally went to it, the American Association for Behavior Therapy, or for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy. And he used to describe how no one would come to his talks. No one was interested in hearing what he had to say. So the stuff.
Can you just imagine that now, by the way?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah. He describes
nobody coming to see Aaron Beck in his bow tie. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, that's one of the things that's really hard to understand about him, is that he was initially not received very well. Yeah. And but I think as it really started to take off in the 70s, and then I think that things were a little sliced and diced a little bit more. And so. But when he was treating individuals, I think initially they had a mix of these things. They had some anxiety, they had personality, they had depression. And I think the first place where they could really focus, actually the way this worked, he said this, in the 1970s, one of his residents, a guy named Augustus Rush, told him, no one's going to believe this worked if you don't do a clinical trial. And Beck said, well, I don't want to run a clinical trial. That's too much work. And so apparently Rush said, well, I'll help you. And so that's that first study. It's the first study that shows a psychotherapy being equivalent to a medication. And it was published in 79. And the book, Cognitive Therapy for Depression, which is one of Guilford Press's biggest sellers, was published. It essentially was a sort of expanded version of the manual for that study. So I think initially, it's just the time period in which he evolved it. There were lots of different things. So I think he knew, and his joke is, well, I didn't want to do a clinical trial. Now I've done 8 of them. So that's what they did. They moved from depression to anxiety. Then they moved to personality disorders, and you can follow his books. His books come out as they're so. And what he describes is that as he moved into the new area, they would take what they knew and they would systematically study it. They do some psychopathology studies. They would design the treatment, and then they would test the treatment, and they publish the book, and then he moved to the next one. And so it is in the early 2000s that he comes back around to psychotic disorders. One thing we haven't mentioned is his very first paper in psychiatry is from 52, which is unimaginably long ago. Yes. And it's a case study of treating somebody who has paranoia. And it's a successful treatment of paranoia. But the framework is psychodynamic. But when you look at it a little closer, you can pick out some of the things that people will be doing later.
Yeah. I guess so this kind of leads into kind of the research piece of it. So I'm not gonna try and make any enemies here, but I think one of the things with in such a organized and systematic way, there have been other theorists from the 50s and 60s that never kind of took off. And I think, and the way in which, CBT has, is because I think of that point of there wasn't a lot of research to show how effective it was, or the efficacy of it first, and then how effective it was. So, many people like Rogerian person-centered, and I also like person-centered, and Carl Rogers was fantastic. But I think, I'm not trying to compare, but I know one of the kind of criticisms, if you will, is that there's less empirical research for relative to some of the other therapies. And you can think of other types of theorists that they have a really good theory and it may be very, very good, but there's none of the scientific literature that's overwhelmingly showing support for the theory and the principles. And I think one of the things, at least in my view, is with cognitive theory and then cognitive behavioral therapy, is that it has, I could fill the room I'm in with all the literature that's been shown how efficacious and effective it is for kind of what you just said for different syndromes and disorders. And so you kind of were hinting at it, but maybe just loosely, or both of you talk about why that's so important. Because if somebody is feeling stuck, or they're feeling depressed or anxious, or they have psychosis, but let's just take high functioning folks for a minute. If someone feels I'm having relationship issues, or I'm having depression, and they look online, they go to Psychology Today, or they go, look online for a therapist, overwhelmingly, they're going to see CBT plastered everywhere, and rightfully so, right? It's a powerful therapy. And so a lot of people can kind of hang their hat on it at this point, but I think, and we'll wave at managed care and health insurance companies, but we won't get into it, but they like it as well, because again, there's a lot of things that have a lot of measurable objectives, and there's ways in which they can meet treatment. And it's not this, 5-year kind of, endless kind of therapy. And so, all of those things of where it is now, it wasn't there in the 70s, kind of like you're saying, but it's there now. And a lot of it is this evidence-based treatment, empirically supported treatment, and maybe talk about how, kind of why that's important specifically with this theory and therapy, and then, how that keeps moving forward with the evolution of the theory.
I can take a crack. I think that sort of historically, one of the pitfalls is in psychology and psychiatry is that ultimately you have somewhat of a charismatic figure who develops the stuff, and they've got good ideas, and people follow them. But then what seems to happen is that it's like a generational thing. Their students sort of do it, but then somebody else comes along and they do something else. So I think there's a little bit of a history of that. And Beck is one of those. He's very good. He is probably, when he's feeling well, he's one of the most effective social people that I have ever seen. So many people. So I think that's that quality. I don't think I personally have that quality, but he's got that quality. But I think that he was very influenced by the behavioral researchers in psychiatry, and that's why I think in some sense cognitive therapy, especially as we practice it, you'll see it's kind of a middle ground. It doesn't have. I think the behavior therapies sometimes are tricky to apply to people's actual lives, but they were really big on measurement. That's often what he would say. He said the behaviorists taught us to be precise, and he saw the value if you can measure it. And especially, here's the thing. He actually told me a really cool story. He said no treatment should be based on the fact that some expert tells you that it works. You ought to be able to show independently that it can work, and that lots of people can do it. And so we're kind of in that middle ground. I think that the kind of therapy he was trying to learn in the 50s was hard to do. And I don't think he was ever saying it wasn't successful, but it was hard to do. It was hard for him to do in particular. I think that so that's why, and you can read in his early writings when people weren't listening to him, that he felt you needed to be able to show that it works independently of who's doing it, and that lots of people should be able to do it. And I think we're really his kids, because when we talk about what we do, we work really not just with psychologists. We work with a diverse range of people, health professionals, and within their scope of work. And so I think we're especially his progeny, because we're really taking his ideas to the extreme. But I think it's really because he that's part of the argument he was having he said, the smartest people I know said this works. The smartest people I know. And he said, it should never depend on the smartest people. There ought to be another way to go. I do think, though, just to maybe sound the other side of this, he's also someone, though, who really taught us to value the clinical observations and the clinical part of it. So one of the things I always try to do whenever I'm presenting on research is to say, we don't think research is the end all. Yeah. It's one of the things that we know. But sometimes what has happened is kind of the pendulum can swing so far that research is the only thing that you trust. And then you give up the clinical observations. But there's stuff you can't measure very well always. And the clinical observations always can inform the research that you're doing. We wouldn't have been able to do the original stuff on negative symptoms if we hadn't interviewed the families, interviewed the providers, interviewed the actual individuals and talked with them. We didn't sort of come up with, so I just want to say that I think the research is part of it, but you need a theory. And you need clinical observation. So it all kind of fits together. And like I say, I think it puts us right kind of in this middle place. We're not just measurement and a very small theory, and we aren't no measurement and this incredibly expansive. No,
I don't know
if you want to say more about that, Ellen, but that's kind of how I have taken it.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask Ellen here as well. How do you see this aspect because you had said that you were doing a lot of the very late stages of training, right? You're not doing kind of first year externs or something, and nothing wrong with those folks. We've all been there, but you're doing kind of on the postdoc side, people that are really seeing clients, and they're doing clinical work and doing the implementation, and they're doing the clinical practice. How do you think about, kind of what Paul was saying about, here's a strong theory and here's research to support it. And then as you get to some of the applied aspects of it, some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so a really cool thing, I always say I have the coolest job in the world. It is something that don't learn about in school always, which is that in addition to supervising people who are doing direct work, we do a lot of training and implementation work. We work with individual therapists. We partner with community-based service providers, folks who are going out and meeting people on the streets, who are going to the hospitals, who are going to people's homes and providing treatment. And a lot of those folks are of all sorts of different, levels, again, of education and experience. We work with peer specialists, direct care service providers, mental health workers. My first job in psychology was as a mental health worker on an adolescent inpatient unit in a hospital in Baltimore. And it was one of my favorite jobs. So it's actually really, I really appreciate that question, because sometimes we have to do a little bit more work with folks who are really in the academia and in the who really are passionate and want to do things right, but maybe go too far on that other side of the pendulum, like Paul was talking about, where it feels like, if I stray, am I doing it right? And that's what the theory gives us. The theory gives us an understanding of people at their, when they're really struggling, but also people at their absolute best. And if we have that understanding and we can put some pieces together, anyone can creatively come up with an idea that matches it. So, I think that we have to have both. And every now and again, when I'm working with folks who are really interested in, well, how did this come to be and how did it work? We can totally nerd out and talk about, where it came from and talk about the research. That's all fun. But there are some people who are like, I just need to be really good at my job. I want to feel like I'm helping people at the end of the day. And if we can help people and know why what they're doing, works, so they can kind of do it more generally with lots of people, then it's a win. And so I think you have to have both. It's really important. It's great that we have the support to say that these things work, that the approach works. But if we don't also try new things and then test those out, then we're stuck. So I think that's what we're trying to do is we're applying the things that work, we're expanding on them, then we're testing them out.
Yeah.
If I get to say, I really like what Ellen just said, because there's a tension here between innovation and evidence, and I think it's important. Again, this is, Beck is at our heart here because he's always been an innovator, and he's also been somebody who's conducted the research to try to back it up. And we're in an innovative area, so we're in an area where the evidence is emerging. And so the question is really what Ellen posed, which is, can you still innovate within an evidence-based practice? And we would say yes.
Yeah. No. That's great, because things aren't, I don't ever believe, static, and we have to keep evolving. And how do we understand? As more we understand about humans, and more understand behavior, how do we keep kind of evolving as well? Yeah. One last thing before we leave kind of the kind of base model here and get into specifics with the recovery oriented. I guess this might be a little bit directed kind of with some clinicians in general. I have, this is an observation. This isn't necessarily a criticism, but I think what has tended to happen over the past 20, 30 years now is because of the how widespread CBT is. You will see many clinicians of different levels that will take a lot of the techniques that are in CBT and will just apply it to kind of like a crock pot, right? They just, I'm gonna do some thought records, and I'm gonna do this worksheet, and I'm gonna put it in with my dynamic this, and my Ellis this, and my Rogers, and they're kind of this eclectic kind of thing, and we can talk about the differences I believe between eclectic and integrative. I think there's an important distinction there, but in terms of understanding. And I understand people at different levels of training here, but it's important to know the theoretical orientation and how you're, at least in a basic level, conceptualizing the person and the human. And then because that's your kind of, that's your roadmap, your anchor. Yeah. It's your blueprint of, okay, where are we going and why are we doing these techniques? Why are we doing these things? It's not, it's kind of like, if I make pasta, right? And I throw the spaghetti on the wall and see if it sticks, and there it's done, right? Because I'm a terrible cook. But, it's like, okay, okay, it sticks, it works, fine, I guess it works, and let's just keep going.
You just do it again and again and again.
And I just do it again and again. Right. It's more of, okay, well, how do we have a good understanding of a theoretical conceptualization? Again, different levels of training, and I understand that, but how do you have some semblance of that, some idea of, knowing that the research is efficacious, and, you don't have to read all the articles, but knowing some idea behind it, and then having that direct treatment or course of treatment, because, is it designed where it's like, sure, you can kind of pick and choose from it and use it with your whatever you have, or should it be kind of closely aligned with, kind of the whole aspect of the theory and the practice? So either one of you can.
I want to tell you about my favorite question that I encourage people to ask themselves before doing anything, before thinking about their interventions. And that's, why might it be that I might do what this person's doing? Why might this be? And this is something that we take it from the cognitive perspective in terms of beliefs. We're thinking about what are the beliefs I might have about myself and other people and so on. But just to start, if we can at least answer that question, can I imagine why it might be that somebody is, staying in bed all day and refusing to come out for their favorite activities? Why might it be that I might, when someone approaches me, start throwing things out the wall? Why might it be that I might? And that gives us at least that first, as I mentioned before, that relatable foundation. So there's a piece where I could possibly understand where it might be that this is coming from. And then if I can imagine that, even if it's just my own initial guess, what it does is it gives me the opportunity to then say, okay, so what am I missing? If a person is feeling super incapable, super disconnected, okay, maybe there is something I can do that is going to increase their experience of connection right now, something to increase that experience of capability right now. And then I can kind of go to my toolbox of interventions to think about, is there something within that that may help me? That's one way that we can think about that is there is no one intervention. So we do like encourage that piece, but we do want to also think about, even at the most basic level of understanding, you know, where it is that a person might be coming from. It helps us with our relationship with the individual. It helps us then come up with the things that we can do. So, I mean, that's just one of the things that I'm very, very encouraging of when I'm doing training is if we can at a minimum have folks doing that, it gets us a little bit closer to that understanding. We'll talk about other tools that we have too, but Paul, what would you add to that?
I would say it's the why. It's the why. And I think that's critical. And it's a different way of saying the same thing that Ellen said, not as eloquently, but so sometimes what we'll say is you can see two different people who are doing the same intervention, but they could be doing it for different reasons.
Uh-huh.
I think what you were describing is there could be just, well, I just feel like doing this now. As opposed
Where's the intervention I know and I feel confident in myself?
It's the old idea that the light's over there, that's where I'll find the key, even though I could have dropped it anywhere.
Right.
That kind of thing. Right. So, and again, I give Beck our some really having us think in terms of strategy. And so we often talk about, well, what's the strategy that we're using, and then what. And that's another way of saying
interventions will meet that
highfalutin way of saying what Ellen said much more clearly. Which is just then what sorts of interventions can do that, and then what are you targeting exactly? Is it their beliefs? Is it their behavior? Is it both?
Right.
Or something like that. Yeah. So we're very much of the ilk that you've got to have a formulation.
Yeah.
But we're not of the opinion that the formulation is really tricky and that only psychologists can understand them or something like that. I think it really translates to everybody. I think that's maybe the other thing that's nice about the cognitive model is that I think it's quite comprehensible and people can kind of get it. You know, you sort of have certain attitudes about yourself. You have attitudes about other people. I think that's an easy thing to do. And when you're often talking with people, it'll come out in them, you know, well, I think she's this, I think she's, you know, so I think it's, but yes, definitely formulation. And it'll be kind of interesting when we talk about some of the stuff that we do, because it doesn't look like traditional therapy per se, but again, it's the intentionality of it. And that's really a lot of what the training work that Ellen's talking about really is, getting people thinking in that intentional way, trying to figure out why the person, and I know it's not very technical, but we like to say, why is the person getting stuck, or why do they keep doing that same thing over and over again? Yeah. And then really the other thing that we haven't really spoken of is trying to make this the kind of thing we're all doing. That's a together thing. If you're thinking about somebody else, how would I do that? Then you're not looking at them as if there's something different from you. Yeah. And at least in our area, I think that's one of the dangers of the work, because sometimes the things that the people do it's kind of hard to relate to them sometimes. You wonder, well, how could the person believe that? Or why are they doing that? Why are they injuring themselves so over and over again? Why do they believe that they're Jesus? These kinds of things. But what Ellen's talking about, I think just that process alone creates the empathy. It creates the idea, this could be me. And that I think is very valuable. And that's all that stuff we were talking about, that Rogerian stuff. Any of these. I was going to say that we're very humanistic. We very humanistic, and so, but we had somebody in a training say, "Oh my God, look what you're doing! You're taking a little bit of Maslow, throwing in a bit of Skinner, and then Beck holds it all together." I'm on to you guys.
I mean, it goes back to what you said before, is like their ideas are very good. I mean, and you know, and many of them, and I think some of the difference, again, not as a comparison, is that, you know, Beck did the clinical trials and he did all of the research behind it to say, look, this is really, really solid to hang your hat on. So, okay, so let's move into the recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, or CT-R. So maybe just give us the groundwork, set the table for us, and tell us what it is and how it's different from cognitive therapy, how it's not, and just kind of lay the groundwork for us.
I can start. Is that okay?
Yeah. So
Okay.
You did the groundwork.
Well, but you're really good at it, so I want to make sure we get your points in.
We'll get there.
So essentially, I mean, and one way of thinking about it is we started really focusing on negative symptoms. So, again, the person who has a hard time with motivation, someone who's got given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Many of the people have lived kind of this withdrawn life that don't have friends. And very importantly, they're often not help seeking. There's a complacency that goes with it. They're not help seeking. And if you think about the beliefs we talked about, so how do we reach them? One of the ways that, so one of the examples we give, so let's say you're in an inpatient setting, there's somebody who sits facing the wall with a blanket over their head. How do you reach that person? How do you establish a therapeutic relationship with them when they're giving you every indication they're not interested in that? How do you do that?
Right.
So that meant that a lot of the traditional procedures that we know about weren't going to really necessarily work. If the person, having them sort of reflect on their experience right away, having them, some of the standard moves that you would make, that you make in CBT, you can't really make. You can't get
talking
started.
In general.
Yeah. Yeah. In general, as a human, that's
right.
Talking. I was like, you have someone who's not communicating with you, or is telling you very directly where you can go instead of being there. To imagine that you would have a verbal kind of process-oriented conversation, or do anything that looks like therapy, or like with worksheets or any of that kind of thing, it's gonna it's just inefficient.
Yeah. But I want to say, because I want to say this right now because I forgot to say it earlier. The stuff that we've learned how to do, we didn't know at the start how to do. We kind of learned it piece by piece. And as Ellen said before, we would have never guessed that this is what we would be doing. But this turns out to be, we follow what seems to be working, and then we understand it. And one of the things that's going to do, when it did for us at some point, is it kind of helped us flip the cognitive model on its head and start to think about positive beliefs as being a kind of a really royal road to recovery and that kind of thing. I will also say that we collaborated with Arthur Evans, who's currently the CEO of the American Psychological Association, but he was the commissioner in Philadelphia. He did challenge us to think about, because recovery is the model for care, and especially applies to the diagnoses we're working with. And the question is, how do you do that? And how do you do it with some of the people who have been institutionalized for so long? So long story short is maybe this is we had a kind of, I think, a breakthrough individual we worked with, which we actually published this as a case study, appropriately disguised. But it was somebody we were trying to do a lot of the standard cognitive therapy work with. It was somebody who had pretty bad voices. They also had really thought, paranoid. They thought they were going to be killed. They would go into the hospital frequently. They made lots of phone calls to various authorities and things. We tried to help the person realize that that they weren't in danger. We tried to teach them John McQuaid's 3 C's: catch it, check it. We changed it to catch it, check it, correct it, rather than catch it, check it, change it. That didn't work out so well. However, what did work, and worked phenomenally well, was to think, okay, here's a person who is calling the police because, so formulation, we'll start with formulation. Calling the police because they're trying to save themselves, save other people. Seems like they're interested in some kind of helping. They also are calling hospitals, telling them they can save them. Seems like helping is a really important thing. What if we were able to create situations where this person would be able to do that helping, and then sort of see the impact of it? And so that's
helping for real.
Actually helping. So this happened to be, in this particular instance, there was an opportunity for the person to make coffee in the community for the community agency. And And so, but the person didn't know how to do that. So in the therapy, they actually learned how to make coffee and serve it, drew lots of conclusions about capability. And what comes out in the tapes over and over again is helping the people, helping the people, helping the people, helping the people. And so then the person begins to do that stuff in their life. They're drawing conclusions about that. And at some point, the person can say, I don't need to call the hospital because I'm helping people here, and I'm starting to make friends and all this kind of stuff. So at that time, we didn't really have the idea that those positive beliefs were important to study and that kind of thing, that they really were so important. We know now, but that's, I think, really where that got started. And I think what we do now, and what Ellen is very, very good at, is much, much more sophisticated than that. But we kind of, we weren't having a lot of success. She stopped making the phone calls. She stopped going to the hospital, and she stopped being worried about her safety. And we never did the classic move, which is to try to essentially help her disprove those, or at least find that those beliefs are not helpful. Yeah. It was tapping into this deeper thing she was trying to do, helping her do it and see she's doing it practically, so that at the end of at the beginning of the therapy, she said, I'm a very unhappy person. At the end of the therapy, she said, I'm a good person. How much do you believe that? A whole lot. Oh, yeah. That's what we're going for. And so many of the people that we work with are like this woman. They've had chronic institutionalization in various ways, and they're kind of almost walled off from some of the stuff that they want to get. And so as the providers, as the collaborators with them, how can we connect up with them, begin to have a relationship that will be connection, will lead to trust, and then can we pivot that into figuring out what it is that they really want for their life, really in big picture terms, and what that means to them. What's the meaning of that big thing? What does it mean to be a nurse? What does it mean to be a good family member? What do those things mean to them? And then can they get that meaning into their life every single day? And then in that context, whatever the challenges are that lead to the higher level of care that we often find them in, how can they become empowered relative to those, like all of us dealing with the stressors of everyday life? Yeah. I haven't used any of the technical terms yet, but that's kind of, I don't know how that sounded, Ellen. That's kind of just sort of an outline. I wanted to build it out of that one case because I really wanted to establish we didn't know for sure what was going to work. And now we do. And we know a lot more about what works. Ellen, maybe you want to pick it up?
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Yeah, the case was really illustrative of kind of the base model of how it functions. So, Ellen, anything you want to jump in here on?
Yeah, no, I think that our evolution, even just since then in these last, several years, has been to really sharpen that, to really define what were the steps, not just for her, but Paul may talk about this shortly, but they did a clinical trial on this, for the approach, and now we're actually in the process. There's a second one that's happening right now, based out of University of Pennsylvania, because we feel like we've gotten even sharper with it, because now we have that understanding a lot stronger of how it is that not just what gets people stuck, but how it is that they thrive, how it is that they can incorporate that into their life. And then what are those things that make it worth maybe working on some of the challenges? Because, as Paul said, there's a lot of folks who not only are not help seeking, but they don't want to talk about the idea of having a mental health challenge, because there's a whole other set of beliefs we haven't mentioned yet that, again, I think are going to be a little bit relatable for a lot of folks, which is self-stigma. What does it say about me if I talk about these things? What does it say about me if I'm working with someone on a problem? Does it mean I'm a broken person? Am I a bad person? There's a lot of stereotypes out there about all sorts of mental health issues. I think that's evolving in pop culture, which is great. But there's still a lot of that people carry around with them. And especially folks who may have been in the throes of these challenges for a much longer time, they've had the world tell them that you need to be away. You can't do things, kind of forget about your dreams. And what we're trying to do and what we've evolved to doing is helping people access it, tap into it, just rediscover or discover something new that really drives them. And that can be the reason to work on anything. And we never have to necessarily label it as a symptom or a problem. We just need to figure out what's going to be worth putting in that work for, and noticing when we're having small successes that build to big ones. So
yeah, that's great. Let me give a little bit of a primer here, since it's been mentioned for some of the listeners. So, and then I want to ask about why schizophrenia, right? Or largely maybe psychosis or the spectrum of why that's where it started. But, and you can help me out here, but for the listeners that may be unaware, schizophrenia is a mental disorder that has at least 5 major criterion, which are delusions, different types of hallucinations, so perceptual disturbances, gross disorganized thinking and or speech, gross motor behaviors, and then negative symptoms, which Paul has mentioned, which is usually your anhedonia, alogia, sociality. So those are just different ways of saying, this kind of reclusive, withdrawn, not really wanting to talk, not wanting to socialize, not taking interest in things. And these are more of the active phase, the positive symptoms, the first 4 active phase symptoms that occur for at least 6 months at a time, et cetera. So that's kind of the schizophrenia piece. And you were talking about the kind of the standard piece at an inpatient level that is for treatment for folks is, I guess it depends on each institution, but there's somewhat of a behaviorism or quasi-behaviorism kind of approach in many inpatient hospitals, right? Is, they're having perceptual disturbances, they're having these delusional beliefs. How do we, are able to help them not have inappropriate behaviors, either inpatient or even if they're in the community, and trying to over time help them not engage in those pieces. So I guess that aside, what was the motive or the idea to start using this with schizophrenia? Is that just the population you guys work with, or that was an interest, or what was the the population?
We went at it. We went at it on purpose. Initially, it was, as I said, I got into this because I didn't know Dr. Beck at this point, but he was being interviewed for the New York Times in the 90s. And he wanted to show a group of graduate students, which I was one, an interview he had with an individual at McLean Hospital. And this interview, I watched it, I loved it. And there was something about the way that this gentleman, who he heard some things, he got very suspicious. But the way they did those interviews in those days, I don't know if they still do them this way, is that he was interviewed right in front of all the doctors and all the people that treated him. And so at some point he gets up and he says, "This man's listening to me. I want you to listen to me." I thought, ooh, there's just something about the interaction he was having with the guy. And I was really interested in trying to learn more about that, because it seemed like that here was a guy who had gone to the Berkeley Music School in Boston, and all of a sudden he found himself, in this situation. And he was getting very excited about the empowerment of the interaction. So that's how I got started in being interested in it. What I didn't know is Beck really wanted to do that too. But he's, especially in the 90s, he was kind of known for other things. And he basically, once a decade, he would publish a paper on sort of a psychotic or schizophrenia. Usually it was a psychopathology type study. Yeah. Once a decade, there would be one. But he really wanted to go at it more wholeheartedly. And so that's kind of how we hooked up, was over that. And as we began doing interviews, we didn't know what we wanted to do, but it became so clear negative symptoms was the place to focus our energy. So that's how we got started in what we were doing. But I think a key pivot point that leads to a lot of the stuff that Ellen is talking about is Arthur Evans, because Beck won the Lasker Award in 2007. And Arthur was the commissioner. He'd been the commissioner since 2003. And Arthur describes the way in which he said, "We've got this incredible innovator in our backyard and we're not doing anything. If this is Lasker worthy, shouldn't people in Philadelphia," they call them members in Philadelphia's Medicaid, Kishman. That's one of the things Arthur did. "Shouldn't our members have access to this?" So that began a really broad implementation project that they called the Beck Initiative. But it didn't begin with what we do. We made some pitches for it, but they wanted to start other places. But at some point, Arthur came to us and said, I've been in the recovery. I talk recovery for everyone, but I really want to know, it should extend to the people who are chronically institutionalized. And we have a couple of, Philadelphia is one of the places where they closed a state hospital and created different sorts of places to fill that role, but trying not to do the same warehousing, which was the problem with the state hospital in Philadelphia.
That
so they created what are called
DC
extended acute units. And I think other places have these things. But they, at the time when Arthur wanted us to do this, they were more extended than acute. And so he was trying to make them less extended. And so he pitched this to us, and I still remember Beck said, well, how do you think we should do that? He said, well, you're going to figure that out. You're the genius with treating. I'm telling you, I think this is possible, but you got to figure out how to do it. And so then that's when we began working inpatient. At that point, we did a small study that we published a few years later, but that's when we really began doing this, and that's really where a lot of the innovations had to happen, because even though the people are there, and as you say, they're often, a lot of them really show all the classic types of things that have been written about for 150 years about people who are, because most of the original writings are from institutions. Kreplin, Boiler, these people, they were in institutions, and they were describing institutionalized people. Right. So we've been able to see all of that, and so we ultimately had to get really good at figuring out, as really Ellen's question, what would make somebody sit in the corner and have a blanket over their head? What would make somebody? Why would I say I'm Jesus? What would that do for me? What's good about that? So that the person thinks they're being poisoned. What would let them know that? So we began to build up our understanding of how to understand these types of presentations, and then to sort of figure out how it is that an institution can. Because one of the things that comes out in these settings, and has historically, there's a couple of books about this, trace this back 400, 500 years. It's always about control. It's always about rewards and punishments. And those things, for the people that we're talking about, usually fire up a lot of their challenges. So is there a way to construe the treatment so that you won't do that, so that it's more collaborative, and so it's going more in the direction, basically like the woman who's serving the coffee and some other things. Are there things like that for the people in these settings? And it was really grown quite a lot in terms of the way that we think about it, because the way the whole place runs can embody the principle of recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And it's going to require figuring out what they're like at their best, what kinds of activities you can do with them that bring that side out of them. Beck had a theory of what he calls the theory of modes, which he developed that to really understand some of the personality challenges, the ways somebody's can flip between very different types of things. But we apply it really right here and there, because you can have somebody who's muttering to themselves, who's angry, and if you do the right thing with them, it could be sing a song, it could be ask them about their religion. There's a bunch of ways to do this. All of a sudden, they're radically different, and everyone notices this, and you go, wow, they're really different. So we understand that as kind of like a different mode, and we call that mode, when they're different, when they're warm, when they're funny, we call that the adaptive mode. And so that's kind of an organizing principle for us. So finding the person's adaptive mode and trying to build it up, but ultimately anchoring all of the treatment in what they really want for their lives, what they're really going for, and you have to get some trust in order to get that. And then I think the programming that you often see especially in an inpatient setting can be meeting lots of people's needs at once. And one of the big things we think about is a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of making a difference. And I think that when you have the right kind of inpatient programs, everyone feels that. And so it's like one of the most efficient forms of treatment you can imagine, because everybody's stuff is happening together, and they're having the kind of experience that maybe people have who have more normal quote unquote normal, traditional developmental trajectories in high school or in college, where they were part of a team, where they put on a play, where maybe they organized a drive. Well, you can do all of these things in an inpatient setting, and then the cognitive therapy part of it is taking those experiences and getting the most out of them. As Ellen said earlier, noticing that it's better to do things with other people, noticing that you can actually do more, achieve more than you ever thought you could. What does that say about doing other kinds of things? Noticing that you're a good person.
Well, I'm saying, what does it say about you as a person at the end of the day?
Awesome.
Yeah, no, that's great. Ellen, I wanted to ask you here. Well, first, before I ask the question, I think one of the hardest things for working with folks that have schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders or symptoms, it are the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. I mean, those are always traditionally, I think, kind of the hardest. I think. I mean, they're all difficult in different ways, but negative symptoms really pose a challenge to clinicians. So it's really nice to hear that this is not entirely focused only on that, but it kind of started out that way. If that was a primary focus. How did you kind of get involved with this, Ellen, and with Paul, and maybe talk about some of the other aspects? I know we mentioned Rogers, but some of I can hear all the humanism here, which is great. Yeah. I love it. But, maybe talk about those components that there's the cognitive model, Beck's model, but then some of the other pieces and how that kind of organizes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There was something you said that I was going to say something about. Oh, what was it? You said, starting with the negative symptoms. So yeah, because connection's at the heart of it. That's what I was going to say. Mm-hmm. In the work that we're doing, you have to connect. We have to connect as people. So people are absolutely at the heart of this, people connecting as people, and then really seeing our role as, they know they're the experts in themselves, they're the experts in what they want. And we're people who just have some tools to get people there where they want to be. And we just really get to help them notice those things about themselves and in a very collaborative, partnership driven way. So I just wanted to add that to what Paul was talking about, that it's really, and that's what that individual said to the other doctors about his interaction with Dr. Beck, right? It's about feeling heard, connected, and on the same team. So I wanted to just add that piece to it.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I'll say that's really essential, because so many people in an inpatient hospital and even outpatient, so many clinicians and doctors and professionals, there is a type of, probably sometimes just kind of working in that environment for a long time, there is a type of othering, or there is a type of, this is the patient, and, right. Even and I don't think a lot of people do it intentionally, but, over time it kind of happens. And definitely for folks that aren't clinicians or aren't professionals, they can be like, oh, those are the crazy people. Those are the weird people. That is a really important, I think, part of that. It's one of those things. I kind of, hearing you say it, is just kind of like, therapeutic relationship, build rapport. We all do that in therapy, and it's like, but that's also like super essential and super important. So it feels kind of analogous there in that way.
Absolutely. Well, that's it, and that's one of the things I think that. You don't always learn how to do. People tell you to, connect and establish rapport.
Right.
And they don't exactly always tell you how to do it, especially with the folks who are possibly really have life has taught them that they need to keep people at a distance. Life has taught them that to stay safe and to not be vulnerable and to just get by, that you have to keep people away and you can't connect. And that's again, that's a lot of our folks across the settings in which we see folks in. This started as an outpatient therapy and has evolved into inpatient. We, like I mentioned at the beginning, we work with teams who are going into the community, working with folks who are living on the streets. We are working with folks in residential settings who are in day program. Like, we're meeting people where they're at, literally in terms of the space, but we're also meeting people where they're at in terms of where they are in terms of connection. So we do focus a lot on how do you do that? How do you actually do that? And it makes all the other work flow so much nicer. That partnership is where it's at. In that us, them, just because I'm going to roll with this now, is we're very big into language. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that we try to do our best around. So we refer to people who've been as being given a diagnosis, because not everybody wants to talk about having one or agrees with it. We talk about folks as individuals or people versus patients a lot of the time. We try to be really mindful of the way we speak about those different experiences. So delusions as, beliefs that are really often difficult for other people to understand. We try to be as intentional and respectful in our language as we can, because it does help us to foster those partnerships and to connect beyond what's kind of initially in front of you. And it's just a really helpful way to bring that humanity into it as well, in the way we talk about and to folks. And I think, like you said, there's a lot of really great intention. We're in a helping profession. Everyone wants to help people. And actually, one of the pieces of advice I sometimes give some really wonderful clinicians who are trying to do a really great job is stop asking people how you can help them. Let's take that out of our vocabulary at the beginning, because if we open with that, it automatically puts that power differential onto the table. Absolutely. Let's find a way to connect and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of just get involved with Paul and everything? How did you get involved into this? I mean, were you there from the beginning, or how did that happen?
No. So I would, if you had asked me, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, if I would be doing this, I would have said, no, that's not what I was going to do. But my background through college and graduate school was a lot on working with adolescents, actually, adolescent development. And I still do working with folks who are kind of in the 13 to early 20s. But there's a real similarity there, and it actually has made what I do now, what I've learned there helps what I do now work really well, which is that you've got a bunch of folks, a bunch of teenagers possibly, who have not asked to be meeting with you for whatever reason. Their parents, their teachers, their schools have said you need to go to therapy or you need some type of treatment, what have you. And so at the heart of it, we have to form a partnership. What is it that is going to be worth the time? We're here. Well, what can we do? And making it really about discovering what they want, developing connection and trust, and then also getting a chance to explore, what life could look like, and doing it in some very active and creative ways. You have to be really, really creative. And that is a huge influence in the work that we do now. And I think it's what gives me a lot of energy behind what we do. But in my final year of graduate school, you do a year-long internship. It's your first big kid job. And I took that opportunity. I applied to mostly adolescent-oriented programs, but I said, this is my last, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to apply to some other programs that would just be really interesting in a learning experience for me. And I applied to Trenton Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, about 3 miles from where I grew up and where my mom lives. And I said, it's a kind of more what you might expect of a state mental health facility, large, big, gorgeous old buildings, many of which are no longer in use, and just a huge campus, and a lot of folks who have been really stuck, and some for a while, and some who are getting involved in the system after a lot of challenges maintaining in the community leading up to it. But it was there that Paul and his team were doing training with the state hospitals in recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. I was an intern who had an opportunity to attend a couple of trainings. And there was one in particular where I was like, this makes sense. It makes sense to me how we can connect with people. It makes sense to me how we understand why it might be that people are doing some things that can be otherwise hard to understand. And I found that it jived really well with my energy and creativity. And so that's how we came to meet. And I came on board with Paul and Dr. Beck and the team as a postdoc. And I've been on the team ever since. So
that's great.
Yeah. And a huge part of my role as a postdoc was going to partner with these different teams and come up with these creative and very practical ways to help people feel connected, demonstrate capability, all of those positive beliefs that we now, again, this is actually before he had ran the data to show that the change in people's involvement in life and participation in the community and things really is connected pretty strongly to these positive beliefs about the self, how much I believe I can do things. But that's what we were trying to figure out, is just how can we get those modes going? How can we do it? And so it's just been part of then helping to translate that into some sets of procedures over these last few years that anyone could follow. So for example, one of the things that I was involved in developing we have a set of like decision trees almost of, okay, so this is who you're meeting with. This is what this looks like. We have it for folks who have a difficult time with verbal communication, for folks who are really overtly aggressive and agitated when you come meet them, for folks who are just saying, yeah, I'm good. We kind of, anything you get outside of just able to engage in a conversation, we came up with, all right, what is the first thing I want to try? Maybe I'll try connecting over some things that we have in common. Maybe I'll see if we share the same interest in sports, for example. That didn't hit. Maybe I'm going to just kind of sit there and play some music and get the person's opinion. Should I play this song or that song? We just came up with a series of decisions that you can make to get out of that stuckness ourselves and try to facilitate that connection. So that's been a huge part of what I've tried to do, is take these really cool activities and things that look really fun and, things that might not look like traditional therapy, and map that onto why we do it, how we do it, and then how we help the person draw those amazing conclusions about themselves so that they can strengthen their beliefs. So that's been a huge part of my role.
No, yeah, that's fantastic. And it sounds like you were saying in terms of the community and working in the community of where many of these folks are at. And then it's now inpatient, so it's in various settings, which is encouraging. Mm-hmm. And just for listeners, outpatient can be a whole host of things. It can be, there's an outpatient clinic, right? But you have residential treatment, you have, probably crisis, you have community service agencies, you have, I don't know what the term is now. We used to call them halfway houses. I don't know what they're called now. It's homes where folks will live, semi-supported independent living, et cetera. I mean, there's just so many places out in day programs. There's so many places in the community where folks were, mostly I would say in pretty big urban metropolitan cities. I think that becomes much harder access to sources in rural areas, at least in the United States. So that's really wonderful to hear on that way, that it's in the community and outpatient and then also inpatient.
Yeah. There's a lot of continuity, especially, there are certain systems that we've worked in that have really great continuity services. Philadelphia, certainly, but also in New York and Georgia. And we've actually done some really amazing work in Montana, which has that exact problem you just mentioned, just to say, we've been able to think about how do you involve people in a community when the nearest thing to you takes a half an hour to 45 minutes to get to, and the person won't leave their house. So we often will start with what are roles people can have in their families. We work with families to try and help people to access that adaptive mode and encourage a lot of, there are things that you can do that you don't have to be a therapist to connect with a person. So we do a lot of that wraparound support too.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So I have a few other lingering questions, but I want to just ask, Paul, you were talking about this adaptive mode. So maybe give us and you as well, Ellen, both of you, but what is give me the core elements of CT-R, and you can talk about it where it's, here's all the cognitive stuff that we're using, and then here's kind of our own stuff, and then maybe here's some other influences, but kind of give us the core of what core principles, I guess you could say, or how you're kind of conceptualizing, the ways of using recovery-oriented cognitive therapy.
Okay. I can get started.
Okay.
Okay. So in the theory of modes, the way we see the people is generally when we first encounter them, or when we see them kind of doing what they do every day, it's dominated by a series of modes that we've just collected together and call the disconnected mode. And that's a place where the negative beliefs are really very accessible and activated for the person. And they have a lot of negative expectations about other people, about themselves, about their future. And then that leads them either to become, and again, this is a little bit simple, but this is how we think of it, really demoralized and inactive, or they're reactive against that. So that's the person that comes out of the room swinging. That's the person who's prone to self-injury, that kind of thing. So there's a couple different ways that plays. But we know that there's this other side. This is the adaptive mode, as we call it. And Ellen in particular has helped us to to help people find that, because they've all observed it, which is, so we often say, so what's the person like at their best? What are they doing when they're at their best?
Yeah.
There's a kind of cool.
If I could say, that includes things like, not only what they look like when they're at their best, what are they doing? What do they know a lot about? Are there certain pockets of knowledge or areas of interest that a person really, they'll talk about nothing, but you bring up sports, man, they're going to tell you everything about this team. Or if you bring up this particular type of work, mechanics, they know everything about cars. So it's looking for any type of at their best, affect, bright, interactive style, could be anything.
Yeah, and we found that's people can find that. So that's and we have some, when we train, we actually have some illustrations of it, some videos that really pop it out. But anyway, so that's what we're looking for. And so then the way that we organize the therapy is in terms of the adaptive mode. We locate what it is, so we call that accessing. And then because it tends to be pretty dormant, you have a nice activity with the person, it kind of goes away and they go back to the default way of being. We want to energize it. So we want to pull the person into it more often. And the way you do that is through something you're doing together. And so what we say about that is that part of the process operationalizes connection, which is a very important recovery and wellness dimension. And as I said, in a lot of the settings we're in, they have it on the wall that they do recovery-oriented care, but it's often hard or tricky to figure out, well, what is that? Why is it recovery-oriented? What makes it that way? Whereas I think this is the practical part that Ellen always talks about. This is practical. You access the person's best self. You start to energize that. You do it through connection and you develop trust. So you're developing a relationship that then can fan out to the other kinds of things. But I think it's sort of like a lot of things. Getting somebody energized, getting them more connected to other people isn't enough really to sustain them.
Or to lead to more participation and change.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's why we need the what we call developing the adaptive mode, which is really about getting at what they really want in life. And we have a particular term that we use for this. We use the word aspirations. Future targets, goals is often the way, especially out of the behavioral side of the things, goals are really big. But we discovered that with a bunch of work with people, they like the term aspirations. It makes sense to them. An aspiration, you feel positive. It's something in the future that you want. It's often really generative if you get the right kind of thing. As Ellen often says, you're never done being a parent.
I was just,
okay, I'm done there. I'm a good parent. It's over. So it's often generative. And
keep working toward it.
Especially people we're working with, they're often so away from the flow of doing stuff with other people that identifying what they really want in life and what those things are, and then really enriching them. One of the big things we do is we really try to enrich it with imagery and other things to try to really get the emotion to go with it, as well as some of the meanings that go with it. All of that stuff is going to help the person develop a momentum towards a life that they want to have. And then it's a context. So I really want to help kids. And so then maybe I have a problem that sometimes I get really hot and then I throw a chair up the or I do something that's really aggressive, and that's not getting me closer to helping kids. And so then that becomes a context. Well, can I figure out some other stuff to do? So I won't. So that's the way in which the two come together. And then the other thing I think I said before is that we have this idea. So developing the adaptive mode operationalizes hope, which is another key aspect. Like the World Health Organization talks again and again about how you need hope to have health. So it's very much about being healthier. But it's also, really psychologically important for people. But then the next phase is actually doing things, because this is an active sort of thing. We're not trying to convince people that the life they have is great. We want them to live the life that they want, what they're really looking for. So that's where we get purpose, sort of action that meets the meaning. That's where we get the purpose. And we call that actualizing the adaptive mode. And all the way along, we're using various forms of guided discovery.
Traditional cognitive therapy.
Yeah, to help the person notice. But what we're having them notice more than anything is those positive meanings. Because those seem to really be at the heart of what helps people be able to develop this momentum in their life and do some things they never thought they could do, and to sustain that life. And then ultimately to realize that they're strong enough to get through the hard times, like we all sort of struggle with that, and they do too. But realizing that they have the strength to get through it, and they can do it, and then they can have other people they can reach out to help with it. But it's all in the context of this life they want. Some of the people we work with have some pretty serious justice involvement. And that can be really overwhelming. That can be daunting, that kind of thing. Yeah. But same kind of thing. You might want to, maybe I'll just have to meet with my lawyer and stuff, because I want to make a difference in this world, and I got to get out of this situation in order to do that.
So the piece that I want to add to it is about your question of where some other either modalities come into play, or where I kind of chimed in with when you mentioned guided discovery. That's a more traditional concept in cognitive therapy. So I would love to add some of those pieces.
Awesome.
So in the steps along the way, we're getting someone in the adaptive mode, we're anchoring it around these aspirations, we're starting to take some steps. Here's where I often will say that CT-R is really a bring everything to the table approach in terms of people's background and experience, because we are working in a lot of contexts with a lot of folks with a lot of their own life experience. When we're working with direct care staff, especially if it's in a more like inpatient or residential facility, they're spending 8 to 16 hours a day with folks. They have the best opportunity. The nursing staff, nurses have the best opportunity to see people at their best, quite frankly, and also when things are most challenging. So they have a lot of experience and a lot of tools to bring to the table, as do other professionals from other who have other theoretical models that they ascribe to in their own maybe individual therapy practices, or just in their work in their settings. And so because of that, we say, bring everything to the table. We have that cognitive model that underlies each of those steps that Paul laid out. But when we're in that actualizing phase, we're turning those aspirations and desires into steps. This is where the challenges are going to come up, because it is not just as it's not as simple to have energy that to then lead to change. It's not as simple just to have a vision for the future. You got to take some action toward it. And that's where we get tripped up. Maybe my challenge is that it's hard for me to get out of bed. If that is it, that's one of the first steps toward any aspiration, is putting your feet on the floor in the morning. So now we have a reason, though, to possibly find some ways to make it easier. Maybe I make a plan now that I'm going to work out in the morning and I'm going to listen to some music. And that gets me, every day I do that, even if it's not 7 days a week, every day I do it, it gets me a little bit closer to being that awesome uncle who teaches my nieces and nephews about family recipes, or whatever the bigger goal is, a bigger aspiration. So that's where different modalities can be really helpful. This is where folks will work on social skills. This is where folks will work on anger management. Any of those more traditional things that you might be, hear about, they now have a purpose. They now have a greater contribution that they're going to make, because it's going to get me closer to these things I really care about. Also could get me closer to seeing myself in the way in which I want to. So sometimes we work with folks who the ideas for the future are very uncertain, because life has taught them that not a lot of things happen for me, or maybe they just don't have, it's just hard to imagine what life might look like, and not wanting to feel disappointed, and all that can come along with it. And so we will just ask folks, well, how would you like to see yourself? So again, we're putting positive beliefs almost as the outcome. Well, how would you like to see yourself? How would you like other people to see you? We can work towards that every day. I can help somebody every day. I can find a way to contribute, whatever it might be. But there, when it gets tough, I can use any of the different skills. DBT actually goes really well here, because we work with a lot of folks who, for those who don't know, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is one of the most common approaches for folks who engage in self-injurious behavior, or have been given a diagnosis of a borderline personality disorder. We work with a lot of folks who could teach the DBT classes, but they haven't used the skills. And what we do is we put it into the context of, we learn about these amazing desires they have to become a nurse, to have a partner, to have kids, all these things that they want and what matters about them. And they'll say, oh, so a situation will happen where someone, that might have otherwise triggered a pretty strong emotional reaction. They'll be like, I guess this is one of those times where I can use some of that stuff that I've learned along the way. So there's a lot of modalities where these tools have so much use. It's just kind of the timing in which it comes in. So that's I think one of the things. You had mentioned when we first started the conversation, very traditional intervention called a thought record.
Yeah.
It's something that people associate with cognitive therapy. You take a situation that happened, typically focused around something that was not so good. And we think about, what was I thinking? How was I feeling? There's a bunch of different ways that you can plot it out to try and come up with a more accurate or more helpful thought way to reframe your thinking.
Yeah.
Because our focus is so much in CT-R on strengthening positive beliefs, we have a really excellent colleague out in California. His name is Bob Reiser. He is a seasoned and very fantastic cognitive therapist, very well trained in cognitive therapy for psychosis, which is another modality, and also recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And so he, instead of he had someone he was working with, was really like seeing herself so negatively all the time. She would very quickly downplay her successes. So when he would say, hey, what was something good that happened this week? What does that say about you? She was very quick to talk about it, get excited, but then would shut down any meanings around her. So he took the idea of a thought record and flipped it to have her catch the good. And so catching a situation that happened when she felt at her best, where she felt like herself, the most like herself, something that went really well in her week. And then breaking it down, like, well, what was the best part about that? How did you feel as you were doing it? What was that like? What were you saying to yourself? And then what she was able to do, because they did it in session. Mm-hmm. The action plan was for her to do this on her own in between, to not let the moment get too far past where you could talk yourself out of the good that you've done. Catch it and spend as much time or enough time on it, because you spend otherwise a lot of time thinking about the ways that things kind of suck. So instead, we want to focus on can I spend that same energy and focus on the things that are going all right? And she was able to come back and say some much more positive things about herself that she didn't even realize how much she was doing that was meaningful to her, because she was so dismissive of it. So we could take some of these approaches and use it again with that formulation in mind, with that understanding, what is it I'm trying to strengthen? What are we trying to accomplish? And where are we going with these aspirations? So I think that's just a really nice example of how we can apply the two, but that's also with somebody who's talking and wants to fill out something, and that's great. For other folks, maybe the action plan is, we enjoyed listening to music together. It seemed to get you energized. What if we, what do you think? Should we do that more often? You want to do that sometime before now and next time we're together? You want to listen to some music and see how it goes. It can be like that as well. But
yeah, no, that's nice, because it shows that there's, I think sometimes, at least historically, some of the criticisms of kind of your traditional CBT is that it's a little, it's manualized, it's a little rigid, it's very scripted, right. It's very, and having that kind of flexibility is very nice to hear.
Yeah. Dr. Beck always says if you think that you have to follow a manual and go, bit by bit, you're not doing Beck's CBT.
Right. That's right. Yeah. That's very, very, very right
on that point.
Right. No, and I mean, if I was him, I probably would be too, because a lot of people do it that way. They really will do it. And that's, any of, my colleagues that are like, CBT, they're trained in the theory and research and practice of like, yeah, no, that's not quite how it is. Okay. So I have a handful of questions here. So my biggest question now, having heard about CT-R and some of the major tenets of it, so a few parts to this. So how is this different than CBT psychosis, right? That's a variant of CBT. So it's CBT used for folks that have psychosis. How is it different, or is it not? How is it similar? And then how would you know, or, I guess what would be some ways of knowing, I mean, you guys are obviously a little biased here, but why would you use CT-R over CBT-P or whatever? Or is it that a false dichotomy, or, kind of just talk about because I'm assuming it's similar, but kind of chat about that a little bit.
I know that Paul's going to take this one for sure a little bit, but I am going to say, like, the example I just gave is somebody who is very well trained in both. We have had such phenomenal opportunities to work with folks who have absolutely, like, just, they are phenomenal clinicians and do CBT-P very, very well. And we'll do the training in CT-R with the same question at the outset: how will this be different than what I've done? Because I think we're thinking it's the same kind of population. What does this look like? Yeah. And I want to just say at the outset, the feedback that we've gotten thus far has been about a couple of things. One is that it expands their ability to actually use their CBT-P skills sometimes for folks, because there is that big emphasis on connection and the big emphasis on a mutual target, something we're working toward together that is very much in line with the person's values and desires, that makes some of the other maybe interventions that they would use to work with things like the voices and so forth more worth doing, or more worth trying or discussing, that kind of thing. So it expands their ability to work with folks who may not otherwise be coming in really wanting to talk about that stuff at the outset. And so that's one of the biggest pieces of feedback. The other piece that we often get is I guess it's a similar idea, but it lets them work with more folks. Like I said, Paul, you can kind of take it from here, but CBT-P does involve a lot of directly addressing some of those challenges that a lot of the people we work with don't want to label as a symptom and so forth.
Yeah, I would say, CBT-P is a very good translation of Beck's approaches to anxiety and depression and personality. I think it's a very good translation of it. But it's largely aimed at an antipsychotic purpose, which is to reduce distress related to hallucinations and delusions. And so you can have people, we go to a conference that Beck organized that largely includes the people who really developed and researched it, and then their students and the people who've gotten interested. And that's often what they'll describe. They'll show you what they're trying to do. For voices, you're supposed to reattribute them so that they're not so powerful. They're not, they're a part of you, that kind of thing. And for delusions, you're supposed to be able to essentially just believe in them less, that kind of thing. And then, if you follow the cognitive model, that should lead to less distress, less behavior linked up to it. Right. We were at a conference together, the International Cognitive Therapy Conference, and we presented it on a panel, and there were some people who had lived experience, and they pulled out a lot of the books that you get for how it is you learn these things. And one of the things that's not so focused upon in the manuals for a lot of this work, it's more than just CBT-P, is the thing that Ellen was talking about. How do you engage with somebody? How do you sort of set that relationship? It sort of is a given, and then most of the focus of the books is really on the theory, which is how hallucinations, delusions, disorganization, negative symptoms, how they work, and then what you can do to address them. So for us, because negative symptoms didn't really have much. And if you go look at some of the books don't even have negative symptoms in them. Kingdon and Turkey have negative symptoms in there, but they don't have a lot you really do for them per se. So that was not natural opening for us. We're going to expand on this sort of thing. But again, because the people aren't help seeking, we had to develop ways to meet them, to be able to engage with them. And so that's one of the differences I think that you get right away, is that actually there's a woman who's really very successul at this. Her name is Emmanuel Peters. She's at the University College London. She runs a really large CBT-P clinic. Might be one of the biggest ones in the world. Wow. And Dr. Beck got interested in thinking that maybe in that clinic they would have a use for CT-R. And one of the things she said is, she says, I don't think so, because she said, the people that come to me, they're distressed. They identify that they have psychosis. They're distressed by it, and they can talk about it, and they want to get it reduced. And so we have very good methods for that, and we have very good success rate. And I think that's right. But a lot of the people that you're going to see don't have that. They don't want to. So if they don't have the traditional insight, they don't want to call it that. They aren't going to want to talk about it. And also things like alternative explanations. It's going to be pretty hard for somebody who believes they're Jesus to come up with alternative explanations to being Jesus as a sort of way forward, I think. So there's an opening to a different group of people that I think traditional psychiatric rehabilitation, CBT-P, aren't as naturally, you can't start with those things. And so we needed to develop that earlier part. And it's exactly what Ellen said. Once you get into the sort of access the adaptive mode, to use our words, and really find out what the person wants, it could be you can use these kinds of interventions because they have difficulty with voices. They may have difficulty with some of these beliefs. And we certainly, our formulation about where those challenges come from is very much the same or similar. I think we approach delusions a little bit differently, which we could talk about if you want. But voices, I think it looks exactly like what Max Birchwood and Peter Trower and that group came up with in terms of thinking about the voices. Not so much, it is what they say, but it's what you believe about them that results in you getting stuck with them, focusing on them. Because it's not, one of the things we know is hearing voices is not in and of itself a pathology, but it's the focusing on it that can get in the way of the life you want. And so that's kind of the way we frame it. And again, I think it's got some overlap with CBT-P. For sure. But what I would say is different is we have the positive formulation. So we have methodologies for engaging the people who don't so readily engage with you. And then we also, because we're not so exclusively focused on hallucinations and delusions, we can take in the wider range of problems that people will show you. And so I think that's another difference. And I think that's why in some of the institutional settings, I think that we had the staff like it because they might even say, well, I'm not sure about negative symptoms, but boy, I'm tired of the guy getting so angry. I just, what can we do to help him with that? And we're just a little bit broader, but I think, so that's why we're very much a sort of conceptual model, try to figure things out. And then how can we move the person forward, building up their best self? So I would say the people that, the person that, Bob Reiser, there's a few other people, they can describe to you how these things they're not really the same thing, but there's certainly a big overlap with them. And I think I tried to answer your question because I certainly think anyone who's really distressed with their voices or this kind of thing and really wants to work on those directly, CBT-P is a very good fit. And some of those people might find CT-R to be kind of roundabout, right? Because they've already decided what they want to do, and so it might not look like a good thing for them.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it's very helpful. It's, maybe to the common listener, they're, it's like, oh my gosh, all these alphabet soups of all these, oh my gosh, but it's all of that like clicks for me right away. But I'm mindful that other people are like, what is this? So, but yeah, I not to make it too fine a point, but it sounds like CBT-P psychosis is for, or has an emphasis on more of the positive symptoms of what we call it schizophrenia, or more so of specifically the auditory and visual hallucinations and delusional thinking. And it's more of that pathology kind of sorts of that. How do we stop the negative or maladaptive ways of behaving? And CT-R is more of the kind of be a starting point, or major emphasis is the negative symptoms, which are, again, have been very abandoned. I mean, when I was in grad school, it was like, yeah, those things exist, they happen. And yeah, we should just try to minimize it as fast as we can. But it wasn't really anything to really tangibly have some type of rehabilitation on. So a lot of that in terms of the negative symptoms, and then the positive emphasis, which was kind of my other question, and you kind of answered it, which was, okay, CT-R has a lot of a positive emphasis, but you're still going to have the negative aspects as well. You're still going to have the pathology. You're still going to have hallucinations and delusions, and how would CT-R fit for that? And it sounds like you just kind of mentioned that there's some ways of thinking about the or the hallucinations, they're real, but how much you entertain it or how far you follow it could be helpful. And then maybe in another way, there's a kind of a supplement for maybe folks do CBT-P or something else. I guess the other thing I would ask about this, and I don't know if we've mentioned it at this point, we've been talking about schizophrenia specifically. I definitely could see CT-R being really helpful for schizoaffective disorder.
Yep.
I mean, I could see that really, and that's more common than it was. And maybe it's just a kind of a picky diagnostic thing, but you see that often, folks have schizoaffective, again, for listeners, it's very similar to schizophrenia, but you also have depressive symptoms concurrently as well. And so I could see CT-R being tremendous for that. But what about other, this is sort of, maybe it's not, maybe I'm just not hearing it right. This, we've been talking about it in a very pure sense, but as you know, most folks that have schizophrenia and or any of the other psychotic disorders, they typically have some type of co-occurring disorders, right? So namely many substance abuse disorders, sometimes mood, I've kind of mentioned schizoaffective, but other mood separately, sometimes personality disorders, probably less likely, and sometimes anxiety, et cetera. So there's co-occurring, there's also major neurocognitive issues that can happen. Sometimes there's intellectual disabilities. So how does, CT-R work when you've got a bunch of stuff going on with somebody, and how do you work with that, or how do you look at that?
So people are complex. We all are, right? We all have our stuff. And this is, and life is stressful. So we all have our stuff that comes up, whatever it looks like when stress happens, right? So we have to be able to address the whole thing. Yeah. And I think, Paul alluded to this when he was talking about, we've got folks who maybe they have the diagnostic set, but they also are really aggressive. So we can apply the model to essentially anything that a person is experiencing, or the way in which they're navigating the world, because that's where, again, the cognitive model is our anchoring point. As we talked about, it's been applied to all of those. It's been applied into substance use. It's been applied to personality. It's applied to mood. I mean, we can, one of the things that we can do to get out of some of the labeling that folks can do to themselves is just really thinking about the way in which people respond to stress and how we understand it. How do we understand the good stuff? How do we understand the response to stress? And those beliefs that underlie it, maybe some of the same ones contribute to many of the same, things that we see. So if I see myself as disconnected and incapable, and I see other people as being a source of threat, it would make sense that I might hear voices that tell me I'm a loser and that I'm horrible and that I should never do anything. It might also make sense that the only thing I see myself as being good at is using. And that's the only time I've ever connected with somebody, is if I'm out and I'm using, or my family, like using is what we do in my family. It's the only way I belong. But my sense of not belonging also maybe contributes to some beliefs that I express, like about being, a member of the royal family, because that's a really great way to belong. At the end of the day, when we take away kind of, if we just take a step away from what it is that we're seeing on the surface and that exterior, and we get to what's underneath, why it might be that these things are happening, we can have a couple interventions or a couple approaches that will, if we're targeting a belief that underlies multiple sources of the way stress is expressed, we can be really, really efficient. We can tackle all of those pieces with this understanding. So just to give a quick example, we do an intervention with folks creating a recovery image. It's really focused on the aspirations. It's about exploring who, what, where, when, the details, using the senses to create these images. Sometimes we will visibly create things. People do vision boards all the time, in a lot of different modalities. But the way in which we use these recovery images that we create is we try to then tie it to how the person will see themselves, how they want to see themselves, how they want other people to see them, and how they want to feel as well, to not lose that piece of it. It's really important how they want to feel. And usually just in the creation of these images, verbally or on paper, or on the computers, that will bring about really positive affect right in the moment. And we will talk with folks about if going through this and describing this image right now makes you feel like this right now, can you imagine what it might feel like if you were to take some steps and do it? that gives us momentum and motivation to think about how we can address any of those challenges that we mentioned. So for the folks who are engaging in a lot of substance use, or those who are engaging in self-harm behaviors, or some of those more external ways of kind of navigating the world and navigating their stress as well, that image can be a really anchoring, very, emotionally anchored point, something they can refer back to. This is a reason why I'm going to, do something different. It's not just about staying sober or not doing something. It's about there's something else I can do that's going to get me closer to what I want. So that's just an example of how we use it there. You mentioned the mood components. Absolutely. We are very big into talking about how a person can refocus the energy that they're putting into let's say they're really expansive. They're super expansive. That takes a lot of energy. Being depressed, being anxious takes a lot of energy, and it can be exhausting. So we find ways to refocus the energy that people are putting there and shifting them onto more of those aspiration-driven, purpose-driven activities, and then help them notice their abilities along the way. So, the long and short of it being our model gives us the roadmap to be able to do that with whatever a person's bringing to the table.
So I have two, I guess, other, quick questions here, which are, you can just chat about it briefly. So obviously the Beck's cognitive model is the basis, and there's, as we've talked about, so much literature on that. But what have been the empirical research findings for CT-R itself? How many studies have been done? How many clinical trials? How has that been, or what is the progress of that? How does that keep moving, and what's the future of it? How has that been going thus far?
So as Ellen said earlier, there was a clinical trial we published some years ago, which was the original one. There's one currently in progress at the University of Pennsylvania, which is it takes a couple of years for one of those things to be completed. Additionally, we have pretty good research for the conceptual model of it. That's probably the most advanced, because many different groups around. So it's quicker research is part of the reason for that. Around the world have done it in various different modalities. The switch to positive, really looking for positive beliefs to be so important, is a newer thing that we've done. We have a published study which indicates that those are mechanisms of change. And then we looked in our clinical trial and were able to, as Ellen was alluding to, show that the sort of people who really started participating much more actively in the life that they wanted, that was tightly coupled with them endorsing positive beliefs about themselves, others, and their future. So we have that. That's a mechanism we're hoping to find also in the clinical trial. We have somebody who worked with us as an intern, who's now a professor in Toronto, and he's doing an EEG study, because one of the things that we recognize is that the person changes pretty radically when they go into the adaptive mode. And the question could be, can we, shall we say, in a study setting, get somebody into the adaptive mode and be able to show particular EEG components that would be related to that, in addition to the other ones that you would see clinically. So that's kind of the event horizon. We need more research into it. I guess we also have the program evaluation. We have one published study on the program evaluation, but we have others that are in the works in terms of trying to show that when you implement this program, the staff, some of their attitudes change about their own efficacy, maybe about, because one of the things that you said right at the beginning, I think, is something that pervades this area, which is a sense that nothing's going to make it better. And so it can be difficult to do your work sometimes because it's hard to know. Because you keep seeing the same people over and over again, or if you're in an institution where they don't get out that often, those kinds of things. So the staff sort of changing how they feel, and then also the individuals maybe staying less time in the hospital. Maybe they're involved in more fully in the community when they get out there. So that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to move towards, is sort of supporting some of that stuff. But if you can imagine, of course, a study design with inpatient units is a little more complicated than individual therapy.
Very challenging.
So there's sort of some issues there.
Yeah.
I think what's happened though for us, which has probably opened us up to be able to do some of what I just described, is that there is a real need for innovative treatments in these settings. And so I think what happened with DBT is what's happening with us a little bit. In some of these settings, they're willing to say, hey, we want to try this. We have some money and we're looking to get better outcomes. And we want to try the CT-R thing because it looks like everybody can do it in this setting. There's milieu ideas, there's group therapy ideas, there's individual therapy. We do all of those things. It has an application for all of them. And you can plug the medical model into it because the role of medications is now serving a person's aspirations as opposed to ameliorating their sickness in some sense. So it has a more of affirming sort of thing. So I would say, I sometimes say this when people ask about this, because cognitive therapy itself, right? If you go back to 1978, it had no evidence in its favor whatsoever. And it had been around for more than 10 years. So I often say for CT-R, we're probably like 1983 for CBT. But so we're on our way. We're on our way. And what I always try to just emphasize that, this is, if because CBT has been so successful, sometimes they would say, well, you need that level of evidence base. And I think it's an evolving thing.
Sure.
It's what you said before. The evidence base is important, and we're working on it. And maybe in our proselytizing way, we're hoping will inspire, especially since our book just came out.
Of course, yeah.
So that's going to allow other independent researchers to be able to do it too, which is also one of the things you need. You need to have somebody who's not a Beck, who's not a Beck,
right,
to be able to do it too. And that's part of the evidence base that really bolstered cognitive therapy, is that people could do it themselves and do all of it and show that it worked.
But before, I wanted to bring up the book, but before we do that, at the moment, I can imagine, because it's got good foundations with the cognitive model, and then the model itself, as you guys have laid out with the different modes, is great. I could see this, being a very nice alternative to a lot of substance abuse kind of disorders. I could see this being very, very helpful and useful. And so, maybe there'll be some down the road application there on its own, and many other places
we
as
have
well.
Some of the anecdotal evidence, and so it's just pulling it together. Yeah.
So I guess the last question that we talk about the book real quick is, has there been any other, in terms of, this is a lot of with schizophrenia and kind of the community and then the inpatient and a little bit else, but what about other places such as, other settings, or, you could think of partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient, and or private practice. So just kind of your high functioning, kind of the old neurotics, whatever, people that are coming to therapy for anxiety, depression, sorts of things. Any comments you want to say about using some of this or elements of this for those folks as well?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I was actually just going to be. If you didn't ask that, I was going to offer it anyway. I've been sitting here like, I want to say this so bad. So it's perfect. So CT-R did start as an outpatient weekly individual treatment and has, as we've talked about this whole time, really evolved into these other settings. So a lot of the clinicians out there who I might do, say, individual supervision with are often in private practice. There is, we do use a kind of standard metric for assessing competency for an individual therapy session and to determine a person's skill and fidelity to the CT-R model. We also have that, and that's typically used for, psychologists or counselors, certainly, licensed social workers and so on. Anyone doing really individual work. We've also developed an adaptation of that for peer specialists who have a very different kind of training background and are people with lived experience. And this was done in partnership with some folks out in Georgia. And it's all about how do they have a really great CT-R meeting or interaction and within their scope and their role. So there's really lots of pretty awesome applications there. And they are working with folks with, you name it, all these folks are working with a wide range of individuals, not just folks with a serious mental health condition diagnosis like schizophrenia. But what I want to add is that Judy Beck has been particularly interested in incorporating the recovery-oriented approach to the individuals she works with, folks with depression, whether it's folks who are very help-seeking or folks who have just been really resistant to the approach. She's been working to apply it that way, as well as to folks who express suicidal ideation. We have a kind of approach for high-risk desires that matches well with safety planning and other types of suicide prevention treatments and so forth. So she's taken a real keen interest into that, and she and I are going to be doing a presentation over the summer for the American Psychiatric Association on how to integrate recovery-oriented cognitive therapy with the traditional cognitive therapy for depression. And the things that she has shared with us about her application of this work to those groups has been, she started adding things like asking people about the best parts of their week, tapping into those more positive beliefs. And even in her book, so we had the books come out at the same time, but Basics and Beyond, the third edition, she actually has a kind of sample of a more positively oriented cognitive case conceptualization. We have one as well, a recovery map that's the CT-R specific version of it, but she's really incorporating those positive beliefs into it and trying to access that person's best self. And we have been partnering with her to expand the idea of goals into values, meanings, and aspirations. So you're going to be seeing that coming out of not just our team and our kind of, group who's working with these folks. You're going to be seeing this coming from Judy Beck and from her collaborators in those areas as well.
Just for listeners, Judith Beck is Aaron Beck's daughter, who is a
pretty phenomenal in her own right.
Clinician. I was going to say amazing clinician in her own right. In fact, it's so funny. You're doing Basics and Beyond. I have the first edition, which I used in grad school. So it's crazy. It's at the third edition. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I feel old. So she's fantastic. And that was like, in terms of like a first book to just really get at this stuff, it's still, I recommend it to, supervisees and some students. Okay, so I had one other question. Sorry. What about kind of the global aspect of this, right? So you kind of mentioned that there was some, again, it's early goings, but, seeing this in different cultures and in different aspects in different countries. And could you see this, kind of some just kind of down the road being, emphasized elsewhere, not just in the United States? I think Paul had brought up, some stuff in England but any other ideas about other people, just in general that may be interested in using this in different contexts, or just as a general question?
No, absolutely. One of the things that folks have shared with us is that CT-R is a really good example of culturally competent practice and very culturally intentional practice, because it is all about meeting people where they're at. And it's about bringing their individual values and desires to the table as part of the aspiration work. So, and meanings can be very, very driven by culture. And so because of that, we've had colleagues from so many places be able to say, I can find a person's aspiration anywhere. So we've had, so we're partnering actually quite closely with a wonderful psychologist in Mexico City who is working to apply and adapt this. And actually, she's been incredibly helpful, because she said, well, there's certain things that we say that don't naturally translate. So a person's best self, what is a person like at their best, didn't naturally translate. And we were able to have a great discussion of how we talk about a person just feeling the most like themselves, or a person who just a time when they feel the happiest or the most energized, or just other descriptors, to be able to expand the way in which people are able to use this. We also have some folks in Greece and in we're talking with folks in Singapore right now about that. There's just a wide range of interest because of their ability to maybe do parts of it and say, ooh, I think we can do this here. We just might have to really partner around it. The book did come out this fall, Recovery-Oriented Cognitive Therapy for Serious Mental Health Conditions, and it's being translated into like 6 different languages at this point, I think, Portuguese and Russian and a couple others. But I think that speaks to the people wanting to be able to adapt it and apply it really broadly. I don't know if you had that, Paul, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. We met some of the people that Ellen was talking about as a result of workshops we do for the Beck Institute. And we have people from Japan, people from India. And the thing about this is that the workshop was happening during work hours here. So these are people who are taking this workshop in the middle of the night.
Oh, goodness.
And then when it's over, it's time for them to go to work. And so they were really dedicated to doing it. And the other place where we've seen some interest tick up is in Australia. There's some interest in Australia also. Very nice. I'm doing a training. They have some of the most advanced early episode adolescent sort of works called Headspace. It's pretty well known down there. And they see, I think what you were seeing was that adding CT-R might help them reach more of these, especially the young people who just say, I don't want this. I don't want, leave me alone kind of thing. And so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I definitely agree with you. I think it's, I personally took it as it made me feel so good. We were down at SAMHSA together, and there was a woman who's really in charge of all the minority mental health. And she got up and told us, she said, is what Ellen said. She said, this is the most, for something that doesn't look like it, this is the most culturally sensitive. I can see this working in the inner city, she said. I can see this working for people that I'm trying to get treatment to because it's not telling them what they should value. It's finding out what they value and then trying to go that direction. That was really felt very good because that's what we want it to be. So extrapolating from that, if family is a really big part of your culture, which it is in a lot of places, this fits very nicely with that.
Yeah. So, well, my Australia listeners will be happy to know that it's getting down there. So that's nice. I will say that, yes, I think, I have Joe Heinrich in the back of my head telling me about all the cultural evolution and things like that. And so we have this idea of, for so long, many of our in psychology and in general, our theories and our practice come from, kind of a Western way of doing things, which is fine. It's fine. It's in Western Europe and the United States. And I think as we kind of chart forward into kind of unknown waters, if you will, really having a kind of international global perspective on a theory of that encompasses the totality of the human experience and knowing that humans and finding their value and their worth and the things that give them meaning, it might present a little bit different based on, certain cultural contexts and stuff. And so that's why one of the attractive things about this model is it does kind of almost an endogenous to the model itself kind of can activate, different cultures and people groups around the world. So I think there's a lot of runway ahead there. So that's really great to hear. Okay. So tell me about the book. Where can people find it? Is it one book, 2 books? How is it? And then other resources and places to know more information, both for maybe just the general public and then maybe for clinicians, et cetera. You just talk about some of the places to find this.
Yeah, so recovery-oriented cognitive therapy for serious mental health conditions is the book, and it is intended to be a playbook. You will get the model and how we understand it and the background, but you get the how to do it. It is all of those, like the decision trees and all of those pieces are included in there. It is really illustrated with. Because it is a very flexible approach and you can be really creative. We try and give as many examples as we can. You can follow a case all the way through. It also tells you for each of the kind of major symptom areas, negative symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, self-injury, aggression, I think substance use. We even talk about substance use right in there. Like that's all in there. And we also have chapters on the different ways you can apply it: individual therapy, group therapy, inpatient treatment. Nice. So we try to capture the how-to for anyone who may be doing this. There's a chapter on families and partnering with families. So that we think it's really user-friendly. So our hope is that people will get it and bend pages and use it and have binding coming out, the whole thing. But it's out through Guilford Press. Nice. So it can be found at Guilford or certainly on Amazon as well. And there's an accompanying website that is that has like the principal resources, the recovery maps, and any of the tools that we reference, we want people to copy, use, and have some good success with. So we try to make everything very, very accessible through the book and the website. We also were able to, because it came out as in the middle of COVID. And so it did give us a little bit of an opportunity to incorporate a couple of references for folks who might be doing telehealth right now, because we don't think that that's going anywhere at this point. And it helps with some of that access issue, like you had brought up before. So there are telehealth resources and in the book, as well as on the website, the accompanying website to the book, as well as on Beck Institute's broader website with all of our COVID resources and our CT-R team page. Everything is available. We like to make as much things accessible to anyone as we can.
And Paul, I think you had said that you were trying to, as you were looking for more research, that people that are doing independent practice and other people that, can be collaborative and stuff. So if people are interested or have the resources or the ability to do, some of that kind of stuff, what's the best way to kind of get at you guys and see if there's able to implement that?
I would say send the email. Email contact would be best. Will you include that with your podcast, or do you need?
Yeah, I'll put all this in the notes.
Awesome. Yeah,
where to get the book and everything, and so
that's the best. That's the best way to do that.
Okay.
We're very interested in that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. We're used to getting people who come to us for the practice part because they want to learn how to do it.
Sure.
But people who want to maybe also demonstrate its efficacy or research part of it, we love to have more people that are interested in that. Yeah. I usually find that when I meet graduate students, they're really interested in that kind of thing. So I occasionally have emails, that say, well, I want to do something different. So anyway, so we'll see.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Paul, Ellen, you guys are super generous with your time, your energy, and all the great work you're doing. This was so much fun for me. I always I talk to many different people on my podcast, and I always feel it's like home base when I talk to clinicians and people in my field as well. So it's always such a delight and a treat. And I really hope people can listen to this and hear, the power of therapeutic interventions and really good stuff with theory and research and applied practice, which you guys are doing. And it's just wonderful. And so I'm so thankful that you guys came on and were able to chat about that. And it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
That's great.
Thank you.